In this video, we're going to look at identifying a substance and all the categories that a substance can be identified by. So in your notebook, we're going to label this section as substance identification. And the first way that we're going to identify a substance is we are going to label that substance simply as an element, or it's going to be a compound. An element is one type of atom. A compound involves two or more types of atoms. Now, if a substance is an element, it's either going to be categorized as simply an atom, in which case that atom is just simply by itself, or you may also have an element that is labeled as a diatomic molecule. Now, during the last unit, we learned about diatomic molecules and that there are 7 different diatomic molecules. You can have H2, you can have N2, you can have O2, you can have F2, you can have Cl2, you can have Br2, and you can have I2. Any one of these 7 elements, when they exist, they do not exist as an individual atom. They exist as a diatomic, di standing for two atoms sticking together to make a molecule. So you can have an element that is labeled specifically as an atom. This would be the 111 elements on periodic table, not diatomic molecules. So if you included the 7, you would have the 118 total elements, but take those 7 away and you have 111 remaining that would end up being by themselves just as atoms. So not diatomic molecules. So you can have an atom. You could also have a molecule. An element could be an atom, but it could also be a molecule, because H2, both of them are H's, so it's still an element. Br2, both of them are Br, so it's still an element. You can also have a compound. Now, for the compounds, I'm going to extend down this direction so that I can have a little bit more room to write. My compound can either be a molecule or it can be labeled as a formula unit. Now, the difference between a molecule and a formula unit is that a molecule, you're dealing with 2 or more non-metal atoms. 2 or more non-metal atoms sharing electrons, making an individual molecule. A formula unit, what you're dealing with, is a metal atom bonded together with a non-metal atom. And the reason we have to use different phrases for these 2 different types of compounds is the overall structure for these 2 different types of compounds are very different from one another. When we are dealing with a molecule, we're dealing with 2 or more non-metal atoms that are sharing electrons. So you end up with an individual molecule. It's a compound because it's 2 different types of atoms. Here we have oxygen with hydrogen, so it's a compound, but it's a molecule because it's 2 nonmetals that are sharing electrons. Here we have a formula unit, At the beginning of the year, we studied this idea of a metal atom bonding with a non-metal atom and exchanging electrons, forming ions. One atom's a metal, the other atom's a non-metal. And what happens in this case when you get metals and non-metals, you get a repeating pattern of positive and negative, positive and negative, positive and negative, positive and negative. It creates an ionic compound, an ionic crystal structure. But it doesn't exist as an individual molecule, so we call the smallest repeating pattern in this crystal a formula unit. So you can have a compound that exists as two non-metal atoms bonded together forming a molecule, but you can also have a metal and a non-metal atom forming a formula unit that's a compound. One thing that I want to point out is it's possible to have an element that's a molecule because these are all elements. It's just they're bonded with each other. An element identifies it as one type of atom. So these are all elements, one type of atom, but they're forming a molecule because they're bonded with themselves. Here you have a molecule that's under the classification of a compound because it's two or more non-metal atoms forming a molecule. This is the way that we're going to identify the substance we have. First, is it an element or a compound? Second, is it an atom or a diatomic molecule? Or is under compound, is it a molecule or a formula unit?